courtroom to my right.
Okay, thank you, parties. I had a chance to review the record and review my notes as well. And I'm going to explain and give you my ruling on the motion that defense has raised, the reasonable suspicion motion to expand the investigation to a DWI investigation. Okay. First of all, the defense isn't arguing that Officer Sergeant Lefebvre had reasonable suspicion to come into contact with Mr. Martinez. I think defense has conceded that there was reason to come into contact with Mr. Martinez as he was on the side of the road. I don't want to put words in defense's mouth, but essentially that I suppose it was a community caretaker situation, and Sergeant Lefebvre was checking on Mr. Martinez. So when we hear Officer Lefebvre testify, we hear that he came upon Mr. Martinez on the side of the road, facing the opposite direction, and was on the left-hand side of the street. Officer turned around and pulled behind him and came into contact with Mr. Martinez. And upon speaking to Mr. Martinez, he observed a strong odor of alcohol. I did review that, and Sergeant Lefebvre did say it was a strong odor. He did not say, however, in his testimony where that odor was coming from, whether it was coming to from Mr. Martinez's facial area, or he didn't give any specific information as to where that odor of alcohol was coming from. The other information that the court noted that was important was that Sergeant Lefebvre never observed Mr. Martinez driving. Those were admissions that Mr. Martinez made, that he was driving, his vehicle lost power, and he pulled onto Marquette, or onto 2nd Street from Marquette. The court also notes that there was no information or testimony about what time the alleged driving took place, because I suppose because Sergeant Lefebvre didn't observe any driving, could not testify as to what time Mr. Martinez was driving, and that just came from his admission only that he was driving, but no, there was no timeline for that. I think it's also important to note that because there's no timeline, we don't know how long Mr. Martinez was on the side of the road. We don't know what took place between the time Mr. Martinez pulled his vehicle over and the time that Sergeant Lefebvre encountered Mr. Martinez. And when it comes to bloodshot, watery eyes, I'm not giving that much weight, as the court allowed the adverse inference regarding any testimony that defense might think might hurt the defense, because there was no audio in the recording that in the video recording that was taken. The court didn't have the benefit of reviewing or seeing any video. I suppose either side didn't present that to the court because maybe it wasn't of very much value, and so that wasn't presented to the court. So I didn't have the chance to review any video. But otherwise, the court has no information as to what took place with this conversation between Sergeant Lefebvre and Mr. Martinez. The state didn't elicit any information about the conversation that took place, so we didn't get any of that testimony. So all we have essentially is a strong odor of alcohol and the admission to driving, but we don't know what time. Sergeant Lefebvre testified that he had a prisoner in his vehicle. Therefore, I believe that's why he called Officer Lujan to come in and do a DWI investigation. So the court has to look at all of this and determine whether there was reasonable suspicion to expand this investigation to a DWI investigation. I don't believe that there was sufficient reasonable suspicion to expand to a DWI investigation with only the odor of alcohol and Sergeant Lefebvre not specifying where that odor of alcohol came from. I don't know if it came from Mr. Martinez's clothing, if it came, the court would only be speculating. Typically, we'll hear testimony that the odor came from the facial area and, how close or far away the officer was from the defendant in speaking to him. I didn't hear any testimony about that, if he was standing within a foot or two, or how close he was to Mr. Martinez, the defendant. I just heard that there was a strong odor of alcohol. So for those reasons, and I don't know if the reason Sergeant Lefebvre called for a DWI officer was because he just couldn't do DWI investigations. So that leaves me with the impression that he didn't do a thorough investigation to expand to a DWI investigation, sufficient enough to where he felt the DWI officer was necessary. It seems to the court that maybe he called a DWI officer just because he couldn't continue his investigation. So it was not a thorough investigation in the court's eyes. It was an encounter, and without the specific articulable facts that the court needs or that the officer needs to expand to a DWI investigation, the court is finding there was no reasonable suspicion to expand to a DWI investigation. So that is my finding and my ruling, and without that, I don't suppose the state cannot proceed. The court would be suppressing any other evidence that came after Sergeant Lefebvre's contact with Mr. Martinez.
Understood. Thank you, Judge.
Okay. Thank you, parties. I'll go ahead and write that up in an order, and so the case will be dismissed.
Thank you, Judge.
Okay. Thank you, parties.